Namaste and welcome to this exciting new episode of Sathology, Debunking Mythology. Sat means truth, and Logos means a study of science. Sathology means a science of truth, a study of truth. And opposite to that is mythology. Myth means a fake lie, imagination. It's Sanskrit root word, which from which different words come out. Mithya, mithyachar, mithyahankar, many other different words come out. And combined with Logos becomes mythology, which is a true and means a study or science of fake lie or imagination. Now, it is very ironical that the Abrahamic faiths do not want to call their history as mythology, but they want to call everyone else's history as mythology. And that's why there was a need for creating this term, Sathology, because we all know that we can archaeologically, astronomically, and also on many of the parameters, we can prove that the Vedic history was truth. And so we have very, very special guest. And today we are going to talk about the history and how the British destroyed the Indian arms industry and the colonial influence. The reason was very simple. They were scared to lose their grip on power, which was through their military. And if you do not know that the British imperial history was all about spreading Christianity in India. And that was the main goal. That was a papal bull. And it is in my upcoming book, A Curse on the Natives. You will also see that in much detail. So we have very, very special guest today who has he has come on our show a couple of times, and he has written books on ancient Maratha history, their war strategies, and their weapons, which is very, very interesting for most of us. Today, India is living in a very difficult time. So this kind of knowledge will help us understand the fight is still going on. So without delay, let us welcome Sri Anish Gokhale.
Thank you. Thank you. And once again, thank you for inviting me. For I believe that this is my third or fourth session with Sathology.
Yes.
And I hope that this one will be as well received and informative as the previous two have been. Sathology has been a great help in this. And their sessions are wonderful. And love interacting with Sathology on these topics. Like you mentioned, yes, I've written a few books, three of them. My latest one is titled Battles of the Maratha Empire. And it's about the important battles, war strategies, kind of challenges faced by them, the effects of those battles, right from the days of Chhatrapati Shivaji to the fall of the Maratha Empire in 1818. So that's my latest book. Prior to this, I had written a book on Lachit Borphukan. He was the Assamese commander who defeated the Mughal forces in the Battle of Saraighat back in the 17th century. So it's one of the very few books available on the topic. So these two books, I really hope that readers do gain more knowledge out of them. The topic for today will be the East India Company and how they stifled the Indian arms manufacturing industry first, and then also the Indian shipping industry. Now, these two are very important industries for any country. Arm manufacturing obviously directly connected to the defense of the country. If you cannot manufacture arms, so basically the defense of your country is in somebody else's hands.
That's right.
If you're going to be dependent on another country for giving you guns and weapons, then there's no point. I mean, that other country can any day say, sorry, we can't supply you with arms. And that is the end of the defense structure of our entire nation. So that is one topic. Second topic is the Indian shipping industry. Shipping is again directly connected to the trade of a country. If your country cannot have its own vessels for sending and receiving goods, it is dead as far as the trade is concerned. Normally, when we talk about the East India Company and its stifling of Indian industries, we talk usually about the artisan guilds or the local cotton industry or the local weaving industries or the small scale industries. Yes, the damage in that case also was massive. Of that, the East India Company used to purchase all the raw cotton from India, then process it in their factories in the UK, and then sell back the finished goods to Indians at a very low cost. this definitely destroyed the local industries such as weaving. But then again, these industries were cottage industries and they would eventually have to adapt to the upcoming technologies. At some point, India was going to have technology from outside. They're going to have their own cotton spinning mills and their own industries that would make these cottage industries obsolete. So that was more a case of change being imposed on them from UK. But more importantly is the weapons industries, which were actually metalworking and heavy industries, also the shipping industry. The usual misconception is that Indians were fighting with sticks and stones or throwing spears at each other, and then the British came along and introduced us to, advanced technologies such as the flintlock, the muskets, the guns, standardization of muskets, of the artillery. But if you actually see history, when nothing of this sort has happened, and Indian armies which fought against the British Empire in the late 18th century were technologically at par with the East India Company. Now, why this was happening? Important for us to know that it was actually happening. One reason is that India was never isolated from developments happening elsewhere. Even at the time of the Mughal Empire, we find that the best artillery was available. There is something known as the Turkish Janissaries. The Turkish Janissaries were an elite group, the elite commando group raised by the Ottoman Sultanate or the Ottoman Caliphate, who would be trained in the best muskets available from Europe, and then they would be doing all the fighting. The Mughal Empire also borrowed some of these Janissaries from the Turks, and that is how their technology automatically came to India. Moving further on, we find that the French have a very strong influence on the Indian subcontinent. So now technology can happen in two ways. One is that you yourself develop those technologies, that you do all the inventions, you do all the designing, you do everything connected to it. That for some reason did not happen in India. Fine, it happened in Europe. Second way is that you industrialize by being influenced by technologies from elsewhere, by doing reverse engineering, which is not an easy task at all. It's not easy to take a piece of technology and look at it, disassemble it, and be able to assemble your own technology on the basis of that. And of course, you have a third option, that is that you purchase those technologies. In any case, the end result is the same, is that your technological prowess is equal to that of your competitor. China's entire technological prowess has been on the basis of reverse engineering. Now, you can never argue that China is not a technological powerhouse or a manufacturing powerhouse. You might crib that they all went outside to the US, to the UK, to Europe, and thoroughly studied the technologies and then came back and built something for their own country. I don't see anything wrong in that, because at the end of the day, you have the technology in hand. So similarly, in 18th century India, we find that the French have a lot of influence, and there are ordnance factories that have been developed in India. There was ordnance factories at Agra, at Lahore, at Gwalior, in the south at Srirangapatnam, and at various other places across the subcontinent. We find that Indian blacksmiths, Indian metalsmiths were working and producing artillery, were producing muskets, were producing guns that were equal in quality to the European counterparts. There was standardization of technology. In fact, there were some developments made by Indian gun manufacturers which were not yet seen by the East India Company. They had And for example, they had in fact developed a kind of gun which could be used as a howitzer, that is, can fire large rockets and use it as a normal gun also. In India, we had developed the technology of being able to meld iron and brass technologies together. Brass guns were lighter to carry, but at the same time, they were more expensive. And iron guns were cheaper but heavier, but at the same time, they could fire heavier cannonballs also. So the Indians had developed brass technology also. There was something known as the elevating screw, which was a technology developed by the French in the 1750s. A person called Garibald, if I remember correctly. And this elevating screw allowed the artillery guns, that is the cannons, to be positioned at different elevations. So something that had been tried out earlier, but it was much more complex technology of the 18th century. This also was in possession of the Marathas and other Indian powers. In fact, the technologies used by Napoleon during his Egypt campaign, other campaigns were more or less similar to ones that the Marathas were already possessing at the close of the 18th century. In fact, if you see the Anglo-Maratha Wars, which happened from 1803 to 1807, we'll find mention after mention by nearly every important British military commander that the Marathas had managed to have technology and have weapons that were at par, if not better, than the East India Company weapons. We find Arthur Wellesley, who after defeating Daulat Rao Scindia at the Battle of Asai, says that the Maratha artillery and muskets are as good as our own, and we can take them into our own service. That is their quality. And he also says that they are in fact better than Tipu Sultan. So I come to Tipu Sultan a bit later on. Then we find that General Gerard Lake, who has managed to defeat the Maratha at the Battle of Laswari and Delhi. So essentially, I'll give a bit of background on this. We find that the British won the Battle of Plassey in 1757. That is something very well known. After that, they had a victory at the Battle of Buxar in 1765. Further on, we found that Maharji Scindia of the Marathas was quite a formidable enemy, and they more or less kept out of the way of the Indian politics in North India till the close of the 18th century, at which time again internal dissensions within the Marathas allowed them to get a toehold. The British wanted to enter the Indian subcontinent, and their main aim was to stop this French influence, which they were seeing that was giving a lot of technology to the Indians. And not only were the French selling the weapons to Indians, they were actually teaching them, and the Indians or the blacksmiths, the Indian workmanship, they were building their own manufacturing capacity. Now you can take an extrapolation from that point. If the East India Company had not started ruling us, we extrapolate from that point to the 18th century, end of the 18th century, where Indians have started to learn how to manufacture their own first grade weapons, and then you project it further 100 years, 200 years. There is no reason to see why the Indians' arm manufacturing industry would not have been the best in the world. Because what we today call the manufacturing powerhouses as far as weapons are concerned, Europe, Russia, the United States, they all had their starts in this industrial revolution of the 18th century. And while India also had to start, we were denied any further steps by the East India Company. So the British aimed to finish the French influence in India, and to finish the French influence and also to check the Maratha ambitions, which were aimed always at governing the entire subcontinent. They launched a two-pronged attack. One was under General Arthur Wellesley, also known as the Duke of Wellington. Those are from the Mumbai-Pune region. We recognize a mountain known as Duke's Nose on the Mumbai-Pune highway, and this Duke is referring to Arthur Wellesley. So under Major General Arthur Wellesley, a campaign was launched in Maharashtra under General Gerard Lake, who had once fought under Lord Cornwallis in the American Revolution. The campaign was launched in the Doab region. The end result of both the campaigns was that the British won. And why they won is not because of superior firepower, which they all agree that the Maratha artillery and guns were equal in quality to the British guns, but because the French commanders, which they had posed so much faith in, deserted them at the last moment. As soon as the French who had raised their battalions, infantry battalions, armed them, taught them the muskets, the artillery, but the Marathas were winning. So long as they were winning, the French commanders stayed with them. But then the French commanders such as Peron and Boutronet and many others, when they saw that an equally strong army, that is the East India Company, is going to fight them, they deserted the Indian rulers. With the end result that without the leadership of the French, the Marathas lost. The arms manufacturing of the 18th century had led to creation of certain battlefield techniques which had really brought to focus the role of leadership. Why is Napoleon so highly regarded is because he provided the leadership that was required for these new muskets and artillery to function properly. The 18th century flintlocks, matchlocks, they were deadly when they were used in formations and patterns. If you could get those 50 guns to fire at the same time, it was impossible to get defeated, which is what Napoleon did, especially on the Egypt campaign, where he got outnumbered 4-1 or 5-1, still managed to win. And for that, he needed a leader who could actually manage those troops in battle. Unfortunately, because the French deserted the Marathas at the last moment, they did not have this kind of leadership against the British. But they still had the ordnance and the muskets and the guns. As I mentioned, Arthur Wellesley mentions that the muskets were of the top quality. We will have dispatches of General Gerard Lake to the Governor General of the time, was also Wellesley, that is Richard Wellesley. Again mentioning that the guns procured from the Marathas at the Anglo-Maratha wars were equal in quality, if not better. So technological equality was not a problem. And this was one of the main reasons that the British opened the campaign against the Indians, as to deny them this technology. Now, having obtained control of these various ordnance manufacturing factories from the Marathas, they ensured that they were totally dismantled. The metalsmiths, worksmiths, they could not work for any Indian power. They had to work for the East India Company. And this process starts right in 1775, even 30 years before they faced the Marathas in the Anglo-Maratha wars. In 1765, as we know, the British had, by the Battle of Buxar, managed to totally demolish whatever resistance was possible in Bengal, and they now got the Diwani rights, the right to collect tax, right to raise an army. Few years later, in 1773, the Nawab of Awadh, Shujauddaulah, he approached the British and said that I want your protection against who? Against the Marathas led by Mahatji Shinde or Mahatji Scindia, who is threatening to cross the Ganga and attack my territories. Mahatji Scindia at this moment intended to cross the Ganga and attack Shujauddaulah so that he could free the towns of Prayag and Varanasi or Banaras from his rule. To prevent this act of Mahatji Scindia of taking over Prayag and Banaras, Shujauddaulah called the British. And that is how Awadh, that is eastern UP and some parts of Bihar, went under British rule. Now, having done this very important change happened for the British as a result of getting control of Awadh. Not direct control as yet, but a very strong influence because they were allied to the Nawab of Awadh. Now, this part of India, eastern UP and Bihar, has immense deposits of one, saltpeter, which is the most basic ingredient in gunpowder. Second, it has immense deposits of tin, copper, and iron, which is why you have all those tin manufacturing units in Jharkhand, Bihar, other places, such as the Dhamad School of Mines. Because mining and all this is related to it. Now, what the British did was first they put a complete trade monopoly on the manufacture of saltpeter. So the entire saltpeter that was manufactured in Awadh went to British hands. Second, they ensured that no smelting or industry for the manufacture of tin, copper, or iron ore comes up in Bengal. There were, in fact, suggestions that let us set up industries here so that we can manufacture our guns more cheaply rather than import them all the way from Britain. But the East India Company put its foot down and said that we cannot have local industries manufacturing copper, tin, iron in Bengal because tomorrow they will become industrially self-sufficient. Similarly, we cannot have the saltpeter industry having to do anything with Indians because we cannot have them becoming self-sufficient in the manufacture of guns. This is how they had a stranglehold on Awadh. Now you find that there are certain parts of Uttar Pradesh where the Marathas had also established, ordnance manufacturing, such as at Agra. At Agra, there was a sportsman named Sanganer who had established the ordnance manufacturing facility for Mahaji Sindhia. When he died, the British pressurized the Nawab of Awadh to see to it that this place was not taken by his son and that ordnance factory did not produce what it was doing in its earlier days. The Nawab of Awadh himself was producing Indian make guns, muskets at his Lucknow factory. After having these deals and alliances signed with the Nawab, actually this Nawab was doing it with the help of French gunners. After having his alliance signed, the British, that is the East India Company, insisted that all the French officers in the Nawab Asaf-ud-Dawla's employment should be driven out, sacked, essentially. He should agree to a British force stationed outside his capital, armed with English weapons only. He has to purchase only from England his weapons. And since there was an ordnance factory already in existence, they let him continue manufacturing those pieces, but they would now be supervised by an official appointed by the East India Company only. So this is how an example of the local industries that were manufacturing guns for local rulers were stymied by the East India Company. To the south, if we turn, we find Tipu Sultan. And Tipu Sultan is one credited with inventing rockets, which is another great misconception. You'll find mention of rockets exactly of the type that Tipu Sultan manufactured, supposedly. The speciality about his rockets was that they contained the charge in an iron tube. Rockets had been in existence for a very long time. Even your Diwali rocket, which you set on fire and goes into the sky, is also a rocket, but that basically contains paper with some barud gunpowder filled inside. This was what Tipu Sultan talking about was an iron canister, which obviously could hold a much greater charge. It could be, fitted on a sword blade. They actually did this so that the sword blade also cuts, and that iron could splinter and kill people. But an exact description of that same kind of iron barrel rocket where the charge is put in an iron cartridge or iron canister can be found at the Maratha Anglo War, the first Anglo-Maratha War, in the Battle of Vadgaon, where the same rocket is mentioned. And in fact, a person known as Lieutenant Colonel Mackay died due to one of these rockets hitting him. Few years prior to that, in 1775, a British person known as James Forbes actually described the entire Maratha rocket having this iron canister fitted on a bamboo or fitted on an iron spike and causing great destruction to the armies. And it is something that the British do not have an answer for at that point of time. So we find that the rockets and iron canister rockets, which would later make Tipu Sultan famous, already were in existence at least in 1775, if not earlier, in the hands of the Marathas. Coming to Tipu Sultan, the Tipu Sultan iron cartridge rockets were new for the British, so new that they took some of these pieces to England, where a person known as Sir Michael Congreve studied them and then produced their own rockets known as Congreve rockets, and they were in the British Army till at least the 1850s. We're talking about Tipu Sultan, who died in 1799 fighting against the British at Seringapatam. So this is a case where technology already in existence in India, that is of those iron canister rockets, finding its way to Britain, not the other way around. Tipu had also, that is the Mysore army, had also established ordnance depots, gun manufacturing units in Mysore, the Mysore province. After being defeated in the Anglo-Mysore War, the British recovered 1,100,000 pieces of ammunition from Tipu Sultan. What they could use, they used. His entire ammunition manufacturing was taken over by the British. The local, the new ruler who had been installed by the British, which is now today known as the Wadaya royal family, the new rulers had to compulsorily purchase arms from the East India Company, and any local arm manufacturing that Mysore may or may not have had under Tipu Sultan was completely destroyed. Of course, Tipu Sultan is hardly a name worth remembering. He carried out a lot of destruction. He destroyed hundreds of temples, especially in Kerala, converted lakhs of people to Islam forcefully. In fact, there is, I don't recall correctly which clan, but there is a clan of Hindus in Kerala even today who do not celebrate Diwali, who just light one small lamp in a corner somewhere. They will not burst crackers, they will not distribute sweets. Why? Because of this Tipu Sultan invasion of the 18th century. But in the topic at hand, ordnance, guns, artillery, the Mysore army was actually up to speed with the technologies of the day. So whatever part of India they captured, they ensured that the local arms manufacturing passed entirely into East India Company hands. And this is how they destroyed this industry. Any suggestions that local should be allowed to manufacture their own arms was completely pushed aside, saying that we cannot allow Indians to manufacture arms. There was a foundry, that is a place where guns are manufactured, at Fort William in Calcutta. A law was created that no Indian, no dark-skinned person, nobody of even mixed race, that is a mixture, that is a descendant from both Indian and British, is allowed to step inside that place. So you can imagine the kind of control they're trying to aim at. And as a result of which, you find that the manufacturing of the arms was so totally in British hands right from the beginning, right from the end of the 18th century. That this entire industrial revolution that was happening elsewhere in the world and really revolutionizing weapons manufacturing. But the British ensured that they manufactured very good guns in Indian foundries and using Indian artisans and using Indian skills. In fact, the India pattern musket, which was invented around 1797, became a mainstay of the British Army. Can you even imagine that a thing known as a weapon called the India pattern musket becomes a mainstay of the British Indian Army, but Indians are absolutely clueless regarding the latest developments in the arms sector. So this is the kind of stifling of technology that the British indulged in. with the end result that even with independence in 1947, India took a lot of time to come out of this colonial hangover. Of course, we had our own reasons, starting with should we have our own manufacturing industry and talks after that. But it had its roots in this 18th century laws which carried into 19th century also, where we were such a big laggard as far as arms manufacturing concerned, such as the psyche was not tuned. The Indian psyche wasn't tuned to be a arms manufacturing country. So even when we had access, and the British were actually then had to open their own ordnance factory, and the British left, and their ordnance factories were left in the hands of Indians. We took a lot of time to come out of that setback. So that is what it is about arms. Second topic I'll touch is Indian shipping. Again, a very crucial arm of any country, it's shipping. Now, Indian shipping was destroyed in two ways. One, by the various Turkish Central Asian Mughal rulers who formed the power center of India right from the 12th, 13th century and who completely neglected the shoreline. So you find that there is no Indian Navy. There is only one case of Rajaraja Chola, that is in the 12th century. But other parts of India, there really isn't any navy to talk about till you come to a time of Chhatrapati Shivaji in the 17th century, western coast, and some other examples such as Martanda Varma in Kerala. But the Mughals, with all the resources of the world under them, did not try to build a navy to fight on the western coast or any other coast of India. With the result that the Portuguese, the British, the Dutch had a field day building their own navies on the western coast. It is extremely funny, in fact sad, that the British and the Portuguese fought a battle of the coast of Surat in 1612, and that was the first battle that the British faced in India. It was not against the Mughals or any Indian power, but the first battle that the British faced on Indian soil was against the Portuguese in 1612 AD. But that doesn't mean that India didn't have ship manufacturing industry. They built excellent ships, but most of these were for trade, and India carried out a lot of trade all along the periphery of the Indian Ocean, right into the medieval ages. You find many examples of Indian ships going to Muscat, many pilgrim ships going to Mecca, ships going all the way down to Zanzibar, and that is how actually Vasco da Gama found his way to India, by hitching a ride on an Indian ship. That said, because nobody built a navy as such till the time of Chhatrapati Shivaji, the west coast was captured quite easily. And as the land forces were defeated, the British and the East India Company saw to it that the Indian shipping industry, whatever it was also defeated at the same time. As early as 1779, that is just about 10 years, I don't know, maybe 7 years after getting that rights, the complete rights over Bengal, they put out a law saying that no blacksmith, carpenter, shipbuilder, etc. in the province of Bengal should be involved in making ships for anybody other than the East India Company. In 1812, after they had taken a stranglehold of the Maratha Empire, the same law was extended into Bombay province, that is today's Western Maharashtra, and also extended the same year into Madras province. What this meant was that whatever territory was being controlled by the British, just like in the arms manufacturing case, Indian carpenters, blacksmiths, shipbuilders could not build anything that was not meant for the East India Company. Further laws were formed such that any trade being carried out by ships that have not been sanctioned by the British or the East India Company would have to pay import duties excess of 15%, whereas the import duty on the East India Company ship was 7%. Indian ships continued to be built wherever they could be built of a very high quality. We find that Indian ships sailed for 40 years, continuous 45 years, at a time when the British built ships would sink in 15 years. They would not be seaworthy in 15, 20 years. But by slowly monopolizing their shipbuilding and applying enormous tariffs and duties on ships built by Indians, they ensured that the shipbuilding industry was totally captured. Now, one was shipbuilding industry. Second was the ship owning, ship manning, which also the East India Company ensured did not go out of British hands. They put out a law in the 19th century stating that any ship sailing into England has to have compulsory 75% of the officers, 75% of the entire crew, and all of the officers to be of European or British origins. So obviously, no Indians could officer merchant ships, naval ships, merchant ships. No Indian could officer or be the officer on a merchant ship for a lot of time. And in fact, it was not till 1950, that a ship that was entirely commanded by Indians sailed. That is 2 to 3 years after independence. Before that, we could not have a ship that was top to bottom under the command of Indians. They needed to have at least some of it British, at least the top. Even later on, when the 75% was waived off, we still have the control of the ship was entirely in British hands. So this is how they stifled the manning. There had been training ships for training cadets to join shipping. Indians, although they supplied a huge number of laskars or the sailors to the shipping industry. In fact, 7,000 Indian sailors had died for the British Empire in the First World War, but still a simple demand to set up a ship, a training ship for Indian students could not materialize. A lot of delegations went to their parliament, etc. happened. Finally, in 1923, they agreed that yes, we will use a decommissioned British ship and turn it into a training center, which was later known as the training ship Dufferin, replaced by the training ship Rajendra, and is today the shore-based academy known as T.S. Chanakya. But even when they gave approval for this training ship, they insisted. British Viceroy Council put out a statement saying that we cannot see how Indians can be good officers. And there are a lot of racist comments at the time. When it came to owning ships, it was another story altogether. The East India Company, by now, in the 20th century, become the British Crown itself, ruling over India, established a complete monopoly over the sailing routes of the country. The entire coastline of India basically commanded by two companies, that is the Pacific Orient and the British Steam Company. It did not allow a single Indian company to float. 102 Indian companies started and perished trying to fight these two, including Ratan Tata's. Some atrocious trade practices were alluded to. Ratan Tata tried to float his company at a time when freight rate was some 18 rupees per ton for Japan. He floated it and he offered 14 or some 12 rupees per ton. His British competitors announced that they're going to offer 3 rupees per ton. So obviously, it was an impossible thing to chase. And this kind of loss was borne by the Crown. They established cartels such that no Indians could enter those cartels. Burma or Myanmar was a huge rice producing country. the British ensured that anyone exporting rice out of Myanmar on Indian ships will have to face boycott from the British companies, and obviously that meant a huge loss. So Indian shipping was not allowed to rise. Even somebody like Walchand Hirachand had to face a lot of problems. He purchased a ship known as the SS Loyalty and actually managed to float his own company went public. And after 102 attempts in 1919, he finally managed to have this ship, the SS Loyalty, and sailed her to England, became one of the first ships to actually complete that run. An Indian owned ship that actually went to England happened as late as the 20th century. But over there also he had to face problems. He could not get cargo for his ship. The British tried all kinds of tricks so that he could not establish his own company, which was later on, in fact, at that time itself, known as the India Steam Navigation Company. And as I mentioned earlier, it was only in 1950 that finally this Indian manufactured Indian manned ship could go. So this is the two cases: the arms manufacturing and the shipping industry was completely destroyed by the British interests in the 18th and 19th century. And the kind of shock that we have still not gotten out of, we still do not have a very robust arms manufacturing industry, although India is making all the efforts. And in the shipping industry also, by our efforts, we have a quite a large percentage of Indians in the shipping industry, but ship manufacturing industry again has not reached what it was earlier. So, kind of blow that colonialism has given to India and the Indian psyche as far as technology is concerned is something that we are still reeling under, I would say.
It's a big irony based on I was listening to everything you said very carefully. There is the Damascus steel. Damascus steel is one example. In Mahabharata time, it was known as Utkrisht Dhatu, Utkrisht steel. It was the name. And the records of Al-Baruni and other Persian, the Parsis were all Hindus. Parsis are not Muslims before. They became Muslims later on. But most of them accurately record that the combination of their chemical composition came from India. And they used to be manufactured in India and were sent over there most of the times earlier. So they used our metal to kill Hindus. And most of the times, even the technologies. When India looks to a small country like Israel for technology, for weapons, is it ironical, like how foolish that is?
Yes, certainly. Even in the Mahabharata time, yes, because as I mentioned, we have been producing good quality steel is already there. Even back then, we used to export India-made arms in the medieval ages to all these Middle Eastern parts of the world, other places also. So to go from there, from a place where know-how was there, knowledge was there, to a situation where we are now buying arms from elsewhere, it's still dependent on other countries perhaps. I mean, in the arms sector, apart from the rocket program, which has been absolutely excellent, our other programs have been very slow. I mean, our fighter jet took a lot of time to appear in the skies. When we talk about artillery, it's always about Bofors or some American manufactured gun. If it's about rifles, again, we are looking at rifles coming from elsewhere. So, our arms manufacturing industry is still not come up.
Yeah, like one other thing is, like, for example, just now, recently, Athos Israeli gun as versus Indian attacks. India is buying the Athos. Now, I'll give an example. However better the Russian technology may be with Americans will fly their own plane manufactured in the country and they will try to make use of the strategy instead of the technology at that time. Russians have always come up with a better technology sooner than Americans, always. And whether it's a space or hypersonic missiles, they were always the first, including the missile defense, which Russians have produced, S-400, is considered vastly superior to anything which America has ever produced. But still, Americans will not go for technology transfer from anywhere else. That is a pride of the American industry. And even though Kalashnikov, AK-47, American special forces use it, significantly use it in Afghanistan because their own weapons stall. But still, they will never publicly acknowledge or import from anywhere. They will use it in an American way. Like, so they've come up with the American AK-47 and they use it. It's manufactured by American arms industry because AK-47 is an open license now. So it is only India, 1.3 billion people, which relies on other people's weapons to fight their wars. Isn't that foolish?
Yes, absolutely. I think of all the things that Modi ji has done about Atmanirbhar Bharat, I think the focus on defense is the most important, because as long as you can produce your own weapons, you can defend yourself at any time you want. Now, nobody is going to ask us questions about our missiles, and because our missile industry is entirely Indian, we have produced lots of nuclear-tipped missiles. We can hit any target in Europe, America with our missiles, and that has been 100% Indian. Of course, there have been some collaboration here there which you don't know about, but eventually what we can produce those guns, and which is why nobody can hold that as a bargaining chip against us. Nobody can say to us, we're not going to supply you with this nuclear tip. So you'll be handicapped against Pakistan or China. But a lot of other things, we are going to be dependent on other countries. Fine, we may have probably signed some trade agreement with them that if you hold weapons for us, then we are going to withhold this for you. But I cannot see as to how the weapon is going to be the secondary choice between anything. So it's really inexplicable that we are not really pumped money into this importance into the arms industry. Hopefully, we have now turned the corner and things will start looking up.
Yeah. And the second part on the shipping side, you correctly mentioned that India was the home of shipping, and with the shipping technology changes and everything else, but there is always a way to create a new technology. See, India has always been the home of technology for the whole world. Only in the last 70 years, India has looked to the West. See, earlier rishis used to consider that those are Yavana and Malecha, and their technology will be always inferior. That superiority was there in our culture, in our minds. But somehow that has been destroyed due to this colonial rule, where we even want to take technologies from a Yavana or a Malecha. See, the Mahabharata says very clearly, Arjun says, Yavan or Mlecha means only take their horses. That's what they say. Turk, they took Turkish horses, but not the weapons. Weapons, they were always theirs. So, the international exchange, you can call it from today's perspective, were always there. Was always there. The horses are somewhere better. The breeds are the soil. Everything is different to everywhere else. But the weapons were all manufactured. Such a big war they ran, Mahabharat war, they could not have just fought it without weapons, and they were all local. And so the today's Indian context of looking to the West for everything as if it is superior, even a country like Spain, now India is trying to manufacture their next nuclear submarines with the help of Spain, which is such a small country, and I don't think so they are as technically skilled as Indians are. So still mindset is still there. How do you destroy that mindset?
One is by destroying this misconception that the British brought a lot of technology for us. There's always, and it's there in our textbooks also. The British contributed this, the British contributed that, they brought railways to us, they brought technologies to us. As I mentioned earlier also during the talk itself, that these technologies are already not the railways, because the railways had not been invented as yet. But the industrial revolution was already news in India. Um, People were developing technology. People, there were blacksmiths, there were people who could use a death machine. There were those who were, in fact, Tipu Sultan's one of Warden's factories had a boring machine. So it is not that Indians were totally ignorant. So, and they had produced ordinances equal in quality. So, one is to get rid of the misconception that the Indian soldiers, forces, the Marathas, Tipu Sultan, etc., were defeated because the British were technologically superior. And because of this technological superiority, everything else then follows. They were not technologically superior. There are other reasons why those battles were lost, which is a vast and different topic. Touched on it quickly. So this misconception used to go that we were not up to speed. Yes, we were, and the British spoke exactly when that fight was about to take off. So if we were capable of manufacture, of technology, of understanding technologies, it is not easy to look at a technology and start manufacturing. You can keep looking at a mobile phone all the time you want, but you require a totally different set of skills to know how to make one. So this has to go.
Yeah.
And it's mindset changes that we were at par with the East India Company technologically when they came and defeated all our different kingdoms. And technology is not the reason why we lost. Then obviously we are capable mentally now also producing great stuff.
Thank you so much. We're on the top of the hour, but there's a lot more to talk about. Maybe we'll schedule another session with this on this topic. And thank you for viewers for watching it. But one thing I must say that every country needs to depend, especially a country of the size of India and kind of enemies they have to depend on their own technologies, own products, and own ammunition to fight with their adversaries. And I think that's when the world will respect India more. And because the world still runs on military, not on diplomacy. Diplomacy is second rung. Diplomacy, when when you cannot resolve anything, but the strength in diplomacy comes through the military, nothing else. And that is also the Sanatan Dharma also. Narad Muni tells Yudhishthir that Sanatan Dharma spreads because of Sena. So it's all related, and somehow we have been made to forget all these things. And thank you for reminding us. Anishji will set up another discussion only on these points, that how Indian indigenous capability can be made learning from the past of India. Okay. Thank you, Anishji. And thank you all the viewers for watching it live also.